Today we've got lots of chapters, 10 through 14 of Second Kings. 10 through 14 of Second Kings to look at. And in these chapters we find the decline of Israel. We find the continuing purge or the killing of many of the different princes and descendants of different kings. We find a gathering of the priests of Baal, and they all get gathered together, and they are all put to death. It's not the end of Baal and Baal worshipers, because there are some in other countries and everything, and some of the poles of worship in the high places remain, and some of the common people continue to worship the false god Baal and others. And we see many different kings of Judah and of Israel come to power and say how many years they reigned, and then their deaths and their burials. And we are referred several times to are not the works of Sohel, such and such a king, recorded in the Journal of the Kings, and we hear those things. And one of the kings that is one of the times of the massacre of the sons of the kings and everything, one youth was hidden away and kept in hiding by his nanny. And later then this young child is brought forward and anointed as king when he's 7 years old. 7 years old. Yeah, he doesn't know anything about being a king or being a ruler. Of course not. And so the kingdom is basically being run and guided by his advisor, who does an okay job in some ways, but the continuing saga of the unfaithfulness of the majority of the kings, and God's continuing leadership and guidance. And we don't hear much about the prophet Elisha here in this area, other than we're told, I think in chapter 12 of, maybe it's chapter 13, I don't know, of Elisha's death in chapter 13, that, verse 14, Elisha had fallen sick with the illness of which he was to die. And King Joash went down and wept before him. So, he was still an influential person, although we're not hearing, too much about him here. And as I said, we'll hear, about Elisha, other ways that way too. But the continuing saga of the kings. And chapter 10 begins with Ahab had 70 sons in Samaria, and Jehu wrote letters to them, to the rulers of Jezreel, and to them, since your master's sons are with you, gather them all together. And this was one of the big massacres of all of these sons. And it says 70 sons, and it may have been grandsons and offspring anyway, and people that would come after him, his progeny, and it says people were afraid of King Jehu. He had power, he had armies and everything that way, but they were told to gather these 70 sons up and take their heads and bring their heads to me. It just, the gruesomeness of it is just atrocious. And yet we see some of the evilness of human beings in there, some of the pettiness that way, and the fear that, if there is someone left, that they may be a threat, and to just eliminate any and all threats that there may be. And some of it is written that, it was kind of at the Lord's bidding, which, doesn't sit very well with any of us either. But in verse 10 of chapter 10, know that there will fall to the earth nothing of the word of the Lord, which the Lord spoke concerning the house of Ahab. You know, I mean, it was to be gone, you know, because of what God had said, because of Ahab's unfaithfulness and everything that he had done, you know, a couple of chapters before. And then others come, and verse 12 of chapter 10, they set out, went to Samaria. On the way he was met by relatives of King Ahaziah of Judah. And, well, who are you? Well, we're relatives of King Ahaziah. And, you know, and they're taken and slaughtered, 42 of them. And again, it's just, ooh, I mean, how can this be? And you know, reading through these parts of this Old Testament with all of this, there was times that, you know, I just remember my father-in-law talking with me about it, you know, and it just, the senselessness, so much of it, and the numbers of people that lives are lost, and you know, it's just, it's hard that way. But you know, and we try to make sense of it. I can try to make sense of it, and of course it doesn't make sense to me, you know, and all of that. But Jehu continues to be a king with very much influence. And in verse 18 of chapter 10, you know, the instruction is then to gather all of the priests of Baal. And he says, gather them all together because I have a great offering to give, you know. Well, it's a trap, you know, and I know that, and I already commented on it, because they get all of them together and Jehu had stationed 80 men around, making sure that none of these prophets of Baal, these false priests, the people that were the leaders that were leading the people astray, you know, he says, we got to get rid of them. And, you know, they demolished the pillar of Baal, destroyed the temple of Baal, and made it into a latrine, you know. They took what had been the temple of this false god and made it into a bathroom, you know. And so Jehu wiped out Baal from Israel. And I think that's an important line to see, that, you know, from Israel, because there were still worshipers of Baal. There were still many idols and palaces, you know, to Baal. And even yesterday in the sermon, or you know, in the book of Acts with Paul in Athens, finding these shrines to all of these gods, you know, there were still shrines to Baal at the time of Jesus, at the time of Paul, you know, that was, you know, it was still there, you know, that people were still worshiping, and people still today worship false gods. But verse 11, or chapter 11, is when Athaliah saw that her son was dead. She was going to destroy all of the royal family, but this Jehoshaphat took Joash, the son, this young child, and stole him away. And then this Joash is the one that at 7 years old became king, you know, and you know, and it was, you know, in the 7th year of Jehoiada, you know, they summoned these people and they made a covenant with them to bring this son of the surviving son of the deposed king to being. And this Athaliah had assumed command of, you know, the kingship or queenship of Israel. And in, you know, verse 14, when she finds out, or 13 or 14, she finds out about this coronation of this 7-year-old king, she comes and treason, you know, and she's all excited and upset. Well, I can understand that. Well, she is then put under house arrest by Jehoiada, whatever, and she is brought out of the house of the Lord. She's put to death outside of the temple because they don't want the bloodshed in the temple. Chapter 12, you know, continues the reign of Jehu in one area, and Joash, you know, this was, you know, when he began to reign, and it talks about the different reigns of these different lengths of people. And chapter 13, in the 23rd year of the king Joash, the son of Ahaziah of Judah. So he's 30 years old now, you know, 30 years old. He's been king for 23 years. Maybe he's gained a little bit of experience and knowledge. However, verse 2, he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, followed the sins of Jeroboam. And, you know, and even though there had been the purge of Baal and the worshipers of Baal and all that, there was still the false leadership going on and false gods being worshipped. And in verse 6, the sacred pole also remained in Samaria. And so this was, the sacred pole was a place where they worshipped Baal and these other false gods. And it just continues that way. And I mentioned already about verse 14 when Elisha had fallen sick and he died and they buried him. And as they were burying him, you get down to verse 20, he died, they buried him. Bands of Moabites were coming, and as a man was being buried, marauding band was seen, and the man was thrown into the grave of Elisha. And his bones touched Elijah's bones, and he came to life. I mean, this is the power that was there even after his death. And chapter 14 again just continues on with various rulers of Israel, the majority of them, of course, doing evil in the sight of the Lord. And I think that's, still continues today, that many, many people do evil in the sight of the Lord.